I am very excited to have Doug Pfeiffer here from Virginia Tech to talk to us about action thresholds in small fruit IPM. Doug is definitely the expert in this field, and we're going to learn some tools today that help us with our decision making about when to control issues in fruit. So I will be recording the meeting. Please drop your questions in the chat. If you've got something really pressing and you're afraid you might forget your question, feel free to gently interrupt. Dr. Pfeiffer is okay with that, and we'll be sending out some follow-up information afterwards as well. And again, this is recorded just like all state office webinars. So if you want to rewatch or review things afterwards, those resources will be posted on the state EMG office website. So go ahead, Doug. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to take part. Glad I'm here. As you heard, my name is Doug Pfeiffer. I'm an entomologist working on fruit here in Blacksburg. I work on tree fruits, orchards and vineyards and small fruits as well. And I have a three-way split, so research, teaching, and extension. So one thing I'll start off with is I'll talk about action thresholds in small fruit, to the degree that we have them developed. Oftentimes, we don't really have a threshold for a given pest. And so what we recommend in cases like that is just, be watchful of your plants, use monitoring when you can, and keep track of whether populations are going up or going down. And so that's a baseline recommendation. And now we'll get into the development of thresholds and talk about some of the thresholds where we do have them in the pest management guide. Okay. There we go. Now, I'll talk a little bit about calculating economic thresholds, and I'll mention some direct pests, indirect pests, and disease vectors, insects that carry plant diseases. And the thresholds of these broad groups tend to vary. If an insect attacks the harvested part of the plant, being a direct pest causing direct injury, the thresholds are generally very low. Pests that feed on non-harvested parts of the plant, leaves, etc., generally a higher population can be developed, and the populations might be, the thresholds might be higher. Of course, with disease vectors, only a very small population can cause a problem. So if thresholds, if they're established at all, are going to be very low there. One thing I'll point out is when I say direct pest and indirect pest, that's shorthand. It's really the injury that's direct or indirect. And an insect like Japanese beetle, on some crops it's feeding on the leaves, and some crops it's feeding on the fruit. So it's really just a shorthand, and it will vary crop by crop. So with direct pest, assessing the economic impact can be as simple as just determining the percent of the fruit damaged. That's pretty quick and easy. There are some variations on that, as you'll hear later in the talk. With indirect pests, it's more complicated. There's a lot that happens in the plant between leaf injury and harvest. There's a sort of a physiological buffer in there, and a 10% leaf area loss doesn't necessarily translate to a 10% loss in fruit. I'll start off with talking with a non-small fruit. This is an apple project that I had with Rich Marini back when he was here at Virginia Tech, looking at the effect of European red mite on apple. That's a spider mite that feeds mainly on rosaceous plants, but also grapes. It's not the one that gets on most of the small fruits. Now here we see the standard price back in 1990 for the different size ranges of apples. And if you're not used to working with apples, when we're talking about tray, the larger the number, the smaller the fruit. That's referring to the number of fruit that are in a box. So you can see the millimeters over there, and you'll see the price varies with the size of the fruit. That can be used in looking at the economic impact of a foliar feeder like European red mite. So in this case, we used regression to look at the relationship between fruit size and mite days, a function of both the number of mites and how long they're on the leaves. And you see that at the higher mite days, there's a significant monetary loss per tree. And you'll also notice that the impact varies with the load of the fruit. The fruit themselves put a load on the tree, a stress on the tree. And so the monetary impact goes up when there's a full crop load. Now that can be translated to a per hectare or per acre loss, which makes it easier to look at comparing the loss with control cost. So you see, we see the same relationship with the fruit crop load, and there'll be a slide where I come back to that in a few minutes. Now let's talk about some definitions here. Economic injury level first. Economic injury level is the pest population where economic loss occurs, and that's, we generally word that a little more specifically. It's where the amount of injury, the crop loss, it balances the cost of control. Now, economic threshold, that's the density where we have to act to keep the population from reaching that economic injury level. And so there are several factors that come in calculating the economic threshold, as you'll see in a few slides: the pest population, the cost of control, the value of the crop, etc. But really, all those economic factors come in determining the economic injury level. And that distinction is important with the next slide. A term that I often use, and you'll hear used by other people as well, is the action threshold. There are two schools of thought in what this means, two ways of using that term. It may be used as similar to the economic threshold, but when there's less of an economic basis, when the economic study has not been done in order to create a real economic injury level. So that could be considered a provisional economic threshold. The other way of looking at it, which I think is to be preferred, but I'm not the only person out there, and that's that it's exactly synonymous with economic threshold, that the economics come in determining the economic injury level, that this threshold now, it tells you when to act. So action threshold is really a better term. But I tell my students in class that I don't care which one they use as long as they're clear in what they mean. Now this slide relates back to those apple and European red mites. This shows, the x-axis, which is hidden by the zoom bar for me, that is not time, that's crop load. So as you move to the right, the trees have more of a load of fruit. So you can see over time that threshold is dropping, and that's because the trees can tolerate only a lower population of mites because of the stress of the fruit themselves. You'll also see with the three lines that the threshold changes with the time of the season. It's lowest early in the season when the leaves are most vulnerable to feeding injury, and it's highest later in the season. The leaves are tougher, the tree has done more of its photosynthesis for the season, and mites are a little more tolerable then. So if we have a nice comprehensive threshold, we can address different variables like crop load and time of the season. Now, there's another term which I almost never use in a fruit presentation, and that's aesthetic threshold. This is normally used just in ornamental or industry, in floricultural crops, and you can't put a dollar value really on looks the way you can on yield or fruit quality, but there's still a threshold that can be developed. Now, having said that, there are very few cases where an aesthetic threshold has been established. It's more of a concept for discussion. But there's one case coming up in a few slides where there is reference to an aesthetic threshold. So I'm just introducing into this talk now. Now, I'm going to go through some slides fairly quickly. It's just to give you an idea of the economics, the calculations that go into calculating. I'm not going to make a quiz on this. I do go into more depth in the lectures in my graduate pest management. This will pass fairly quickly. There's one term that's basic, and that's a gain threshold. That's where the management cost is divided by the market value. So in this example, if the management cost is $9 an acre and the value of the crop is $3 a bushel, get the grain threshold by division. Actually, it's simpler to do by turning it into a multiplication problem with just making the second one into a reciprocal. And then that gives you a gain threshold of 3 bushels per acre. That means it's 3 bushels per acre that need to be saved for the control action to be profitable. Now, and I'll come in a couple slides to the takeaway message that I want you to get from these slides. It's not quite there yet. So the economic injury level, you take that gain threshold, divide it by the loss per insect. The loss per insect has to be determined through research. That's not something that can just be estimated. And then the economic threshold, we take that economic injury level and just by convention, take about 80% of that. Now, that percent can vary depending on how rapidly the action tool works. With a lot of pesticides, they kill the insects very quickly. The economic threshold or action threshold can be pretty close to the economic injury level. If a control tool, like natural enemies, for example, if you were going to release those, if they take longer to work, then the time to act might be earlier than in that case. So in this case, with doing that division and doing the math, we come up to an economic injury level of 1.4 insects per plant, and then 80% of that would be the economic threshold or action threshold, 1.1 insects per plant. And again, if any of you want to discuss that and learn more about that, I can do that later, but that's not really the heart of this talk. What I do want you to see is what happens when the market value changes, or what happens if the management cost changes. We're in a market where the value of the crop can change quite a bit. The management costs can vary just from one pesticide to another. It's cheaper to apply certain insecticides than others. So technically, that all has to work into the calculation, and often does not, especially when the selection of changes of pesticides can change from year to year. So generally, keep in mind that the economic threshold moves in the opposite direction of the market value. If the market value goes up, the crop is more valuable, the threshold will come down because it's worth it to manage to control a lower population of pests. If the management cost goes up, now it becomes more costly to treat the crop, so the economic threshold will go up. Those are just some generalizations to keep in mind as we talk about thresholds or you implement thresholds in your practice. Now, there's some limitations of the whole concept of the economic injury level. One is that if an insect is a vector for a disease, whether it's a human disease or a plant disease, it's very hard to put a monetary value on that. The tendency is to control those pests at very low levels. Research is needed to determine the quantitative relationship between damage or injury and yield. Aesthetic pests, it may not work as well, again, because of that aesthetic threshold. Floriculture producers will often say that they need for their crop to be perfect. You can't afford any blemishes. That can be a little controversial itself, but that'll be another talk. Forest pests, we're dealing with basically a whole ecosystem, and then it becomes trickier to consider economic injury level. I think the next slide illustrates that nicely. The market value, as you saw, market value is in the equation for calculating economic injury level. When does a grower know the value of the crop? It's often not until harvest time. So the grower has to go on past statistics, an educated guess of what markets will be doing. When we have orchard meetings in the springtime, at a time of frost, there's a lot of discussion among the growers on what the weather is doing in different parts of the country, what the crop may be like later on, and that's to help them gauge the value of their own crop later in the season, and that will influence how they manage their crop. Of course, it will go different with the management tactics selected. An expensive insecticide versus an inexpensive one, compared to biological control, for example. So there are a lot of factors that come into it. And in the strict sense, it's hard to meet them all. We just have to go with the best use of the concept that we can. Also, research requirements. The thresholds that we'll be talking about are aimed at single pest. What happens, for aphid injury if there's already a lot of spider mite injury on the leaves, for example? What happens when multiple pests are intertwined? We have environmental effects. We have the environmental effects of the pesticide applications that we make, and we have the environmental effects of our cropping system. And these could all affect thresholds. This is a slide I made on a trip a few years ago to Colorado. There was a several years old outbreak of mountain pine beetle killing huge stands of trees. The mountainsides were covered with dead trees. What's the market value here? Is it the cost of the lumber? You have a whole ecosystem there, that is at risk, and all it takes is one lightning strike to start a wildfire, so that really changes and makes much more complex the economic considerations of this pest. Now, there have been several ways, attempts at incorporating the environmental impacts of what we do into decision making. And really, these are very difficult for growers to use. They're more in line with calculating the impacts that we would recommend. Contingent valuation is trying to tie in what a grower would be willing to spend to prevent certain types of environmental damage. Another is environmental impact quotient, which there's a long, complicated equation. You're looking at the impact on predators, bees, birds, whether it's a systemic or a surface material, and it comes up with one number for the material. And then with the number of applications that material is applied, you can come up with an environmental impact quotient. And it's a way of quantifying the economic impact of what we do. Again, it's not something really for growers. It's an interesting way of recognizing that what we do has an environmental impact. And then we can look at the overall impact of a certain type of control program versus another. Now let's talk about some specific insects. Meadow spittlebug is a good one to lead off with because it's one of the few pests that has actually had a full economic analysis, looking at the cost of the pesticide, the market value of the crop, etc. And that paper came up with an economic threshold of 2 nymphs per square foot. If you're not familiar with spittlebug, the adults are called frog hoppers. They're kind of squat compared to a leaf hopper, though they're closely related. They're xylem feeders, so the xylem sap is very dilute. So the nymph has to take in a large amount of sap in order to get nutrients. That means it puts out a lot of excess water. It's adapted to take all that excess water, turn it into bubbles, a froth that covers it. If you've walked around a meadow in the spring or the early summer, you may have seen these maths of bubbles or spittle on the plants. These can feed on strawberries. So in this study, which dates back to 1984 now, a ways back, we see, we see the value of the crop, incorporated the cost of the material. Now, the cost of the material is not even available now. It's been banned, endosulfan. The concept would be the same. You'd have to come up with the application cost for a specific insecticide. And another thing, just a sidebar here, this application cost isn't just the cost of the insecticide. It's the cost of the fuel, the application cost to put it on. We have application cost and product cost. And that gets complicated because oftentimes growers are putting on a fungicide, they may decide to put on an insecticide as insurance because they're already paying the application cost. So this gets to be a complicated calculation. At any rate, back to the main thought here. Here we have the finding of 2 nymphs per square foot. 0.1 square meter is about the same as a square foot. And so that would justify the control. Now, moving on to the last sentence in this paragraph, is this estimate is conservative because it's based on the feeding and does not take into account an aesthetic threshold. If you have a pick your own operation, you may have customers that object if there are a lot of these masses of spittle on the plants. Many of them may know that it's harmless and doesn't really, cause any damage to them, but that could affect the willingness of the people to work there. Again, that part is not really quantified. It's just an effect that's recognized in public response. Moving on to another pest, strawberry bud weevil or clipper, a threshold that has been set for that. I've seen a couple of different efforts to do this. One came up with 0.6 clip bud per foot of row. Another one was 1 clip bud. Though that's really pretty similar over a whole planting. And that is based on just the calculating the percent buds with the percent loss of fruit. There's 1 fruit on a bud that's clipped, and you generally lose that fruit. That may be a conservative approach as well for a different reason. That many strawberry varieties, the surviving fruit grow bigger, so the plants can compensate to some degree for that loss of fruit in the planting. So that, there have been some attempts to figure out which varieties, or all varieties do that, that's up in the air. But, losing, 20% of the clipped buds is not the same as the 20% loss in yield. Another common pest of strawberries, two-spotted spider mite. This is in the same family as the European red mite I talked about on apples, but it's on a per mite basis, it's generally twice as damaging as European red mite. So unfortunately, that's one we have as the typical spider mite on strawberries, caneberries, etc. Now, there are 2 thresholds that have been set up for this: 10 mites per leaf or 10% of the leaves infested. It's often easier just to determine the number of leaves that are infested rather than counting the mites. And you can see the mite here, its namesake characteristic, the 2 spots. So those are actually the gut contents. And every time the mite molts, it loses those gut contents. And so there are brief times when the mite doesn't have any spots. So don't be confused if you don't see the spots the way they're depicted in this slide. Feeds on many different plants. It overwinters adults in the ground cover, and that is an interesting trait, given we're talking about strawberry here, and strawberries are the ground cover. So in higher plant like tree fruits, grapes, etc., probably caneberries and blueberries, the mites would have to move up into the canopy during the spring. In the case of strawberry, they're overwintering in the crop itself. And the overwintering morph looks different too. They spend the winter in the ground cover and they lose the spots and they just take on a bright orange characteristic. This is an apple where they just happen to be still up in the canopy when they made that shift and really got the growers' attention because they weren't used to looking at these bright orange mites. Now I want to bring in predatory mites here, because predatory mites are often a very good option to buy for spider mites in strawberries and the other fruit as well, but especially in strawberries. Years ago, I was talking with a strawberry grower in Virginia Beach. All the acaricides that were available at the time, her mites had resistance to them. And so she was looking for a way to control the spider mites. I suggested these predatory mites because especially Neoscelis spalacis, this mite here, overwinters in the ground cover too. So it would be right there at the right time to feed on her spider mites. A warning I gave her was that it's a native mite. It's native in the eastern U.S. And if it's not in her planting now, it's because there's something about the management system that's keeping them from becoming common. And so she bought them, and they were so effective. Decided to buy them whenever they were needed, even though they weren't establishing because of whatever other practice she was following that was hindering the mites, whether it was a fungicide or whatever. So these can be very effective in strawberries, but again, uh, you would have to put them on well before the spider mites reach that economic injury level, because it will take them time to do their work. Another thing is, if you decide to follow this path, talk to the insectary. You know, there's several good insectaries that provides predatory mites. These mites are not all interchangeable. You know, some survive hot temperatures better. Some are better bringing down a high population of spider mites than others, and others are better at maintaining a low population. So, the talk to the reps from the company. You know, the companies have online catalogs. You know, you can contact them there and describe your situation and how you want to use the mites, and they can steer you towards the right species. And generally, if you can have a 1 to 10 predator-prey ratio, that's a good chance of control. You know, the higher the ratio of predators, the better, of course. And the phalacis, the one I mentioned before, it has kind of a random hunting pattern at high densities. At low densities, it follows the leaf edges and will tend to disperse aerially. They can't fly, but they'll face in the breeze and lift up their bodies and get wafted off on the wind, hopefully landing in a place with higher prey population. Now let's move on to another one, tarnished plant bug. This will feed on the blossoms and young fruit in various fruit. It will feed on the seeds or the achenes of strawberries, and it causes a symptom called apical seediness in strawberries, where you see on this the white strawberry there in the middle, the growth is distorted and the seeds look crowded. That's because they feed on those seeds, killing the seeds. The seeds are the source of the hormone responsible for enlarging the fruit. And so that part of the fruit doesn't grow because the seeds have been killed. So that really distorts the growth. You know, there can be some pollination issues that can look similar, but that's a symptom of tarnished plant bug. There are two thresholds that have been established. One is one nymph per every 1 or 2 flower clusters, and that works, has been set up for both strawberries and caneberries. Another way is to sample 30 to 50 flower clusters in the field and divide by the number of tarnished plant bug. In this case, a low number would be worse. So the threshold is less than 0.25. So that would be 0.25 flowers per tarnished plant bug. And you may see the tarnished plant bug referred to as lygus bugs. In the West, there's a related species called the lygus bug. In the East, our species is tarnished plant bug, but there's the same genus. And you may see that term used for both. Now, thrips. This is an interesting situation because we don't often have much economic information on the impact of thrips on the small fruits. This is supposed to be a target of investigation for a big multi-state research project submitted to USDA involving several states, including Virginia. There are a couple of us who are going to be involved with this project. This has been drastically delayed because of the effect on federal funding with USDA this year in Washington. Finally, we learned recently that the project was selected to go past the pre-proposal stage into full proposal development, but we just don't know what's going to happen with our thrips research on berry crops for this coming season. There's a provisional threshold that's in place of 10 thrips.
So
Hello? Was there a question? Okay. 10 thrips per flower. The way they're sampled is to beat these flowers over a sheet of paper to knock the thrips out. And there can often be multiple thrips in each flower, so that thrips 10 may not be that hard to achieve. There's also and a different effect of different thrips species. Again, that should be part of the this USA proposal that we have in development. Western flower thrips is probably one of the more damaging species, and that's caused problems on various fruit crops in the Mid-Atlantic area. Blueberry maggot. This is related to apple maggot. You see the fly there on the left, and there's a fairly medium-sized maggot that will feed inside the fruit. The wings have that black pattern that looks like a capital F. That's characteristic for blueberry maggot, and apple maggot looks very similar. The way it's trapped is using yellow sticky traps, yellow sticky panel traps hung over the planting with the yellow surfaces facing down, as you see in this image. And the threshold is either 3 flies per week or flies trapped for 2 consecutive weeks. And this is a fairly common insect, so this is one that a blueberry grower should be aware of. Now, we'll move on to some insects that have it's been difficult to establish thresholds for. The first is spotted-winged Drosophila. This moved through the country several years ago. It's generally distributed in Virginia now. It's a major pest in berry crops and also cherries. So we recommend that growers use traps, but the traps really aren't sensitive enough. They don't compete with the actual ripe berries or ripening berries. And so you can use the traps to help see the flies when they're present, but be prepared to spray when the flies start turning up in the traps. You can't wait for a lag here. And so a common bait is a 60-40 blend of vinegar with red wine, and add a few drops of dish detergent too to break the surface tension. And so you can also add some yeast, and that makes the traps more attractive too. But pour the contents out into a shallow container like an enamel pan, and look for the spotted winged Drosophila. Males have that characteristic black spot on the wings. The females do not, but you can see the ovipositor, the sclerotized, armored, serrated ovipositor on the underside of the tip of the abdomen. Those traps are very general for Drosophilids, so there may be a lot of other Drosophilids in there. It's not a selective trap. Another thing you can look for when the damage starts showing up, the injury, is Drosophilid eggs have a pair of long filaments that aid respiration when the egg is inserted into the berry. And you can see these protruding from the puncture, as you can see in this grape. Strawberry sap beetle, there are insecticides you can use, but you have to be very careful with the pre-harvest interval. This beetle uh, goes after overripe fruit, so that means the beetles are going to be in there when fruit are ripe and being harvested. So some cultural controls, which are not threshold driven, include harvesting completely. And if you have a pick your own operation, you should have some employed people follow the customers to make sure that the fruit are harvested completely, and not leaving behind berries that are just hard for the customer to find. You can also use bait buckets of overripe fruit at the edge of the planting to try to draw the beetles out of the planting. But cultural controls like this are often not based on thresholds. It's a way of managing the crop that reduces the incidence of the pest. I'll go through 3 borers here that can be important in berry crops. Again, there aren't really thresholds that are set up for these. There are insecticides that can be used for each one, but again, there can be cultural controls that are used just independent of thresholds. We have the moth here is raspberry crown borer. It looks like a yellow jacket. This plants can be replaced that have borers in the crown of the plant. That's just done as the infestation develops. Redneck cane borer is a bupressid beetle in the same family as emerald ash borer, just a different host. That looks different too. It's gray with a copper-colored pronotum. Removing gall canes in the dormant season or early spring can be very effective in limiting redneck cane borer. Any of these pests can also be have their control improved by removing nearby wild hosts, wild brambles, for example. But that is a big commitment, trying to keep wild brambles under control, wild rubus. But removing the gall canes, the pruning is a normal practice anyway. So that this ties in nicely with the normal cultural management of the caneberries. Raspberry cane borer is a cerambycid, a longhorn beetle, also dark gray with a red, sort of reddish orange pronotum with black spots. That girdles the twigs, and rather than using a threshold of time sprays, if you just, as you're managing the plant, the canes, break off the shoot tips in early summer in the spring as they appear, and that keeps them from tunneling farther down into the cane. Again, that's not really threshold base. It's just a cultural control that can be done as you're in the early part of the season as you're moving around the planting. Okay. And that's the last slide. Now this, I want to point out that Virginia belongs to the Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium. That is dues that are paid by the College of Agriculture here at Virginia Tech. And what that, what one benefit of that is that there is a quarterly newsletter, the Small Fruit News, that is put out by this organization, and there are articles dealing with entomology, pathology, horticulture. It can be a very useful source, and they're archived here at this site. So be aware of this. You can go to the Small Fruit Consortium website. There's a lot of information there, including the Small Fruit News. I also have my Virginia Fruit website, and that has sections in it for the various fruit crops, apples, peaches, grapes, and small pears and small fruits. So I try to have pages in there on each of the small fruit pests organized by crop. So now that's another source of information, and I can update that easily myself as needs arise. I also have a fruit insect blog you can visit, but that's not very heavy traffic there, but I do put updates in that site. So if we can be open for questions now, if you have any.
Yeah, absolutely. Doug, thank you so much for going over economic thresholds, action thresholds, and some of the other really good information in terms that we might see. A lot of times our master gardeners are working directly with the client or on their own property. And so on the master gardener side, sometimes it's really helpful to have an idea of what all these terms mean in the literature that they might find or they might come across, because a lot of our extension publications are really not geared towards the homeowner size, and so it's good for them to understand. And I especially like the content that you pulled that is, we don't necessarily have a threshold for this, but this is what you can do to culturally manage it or to control it. I think it was a really good overview of all the different things that we might need to know. And then for agents who might not have had this information in their education, or especially if they're starting new, this is a really good overview for them. So I do have a question. Can you talk a little bit about you talked about aesthetic threshold. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between when you might want or need to spray as like a bigger commercial producer versus somebody who's either selling at the farmer's market or just like a backyard farmer? Because it's been my impression that what we are willing to buy and consume at a farmer's market is slightly different than what we would be willing to buy and consume from a grocery store.
I can say a little bit about that. It's there's a lot of subjectivity here, and there are two kinds of cosmetic issues. The one I was talking about was a spittle bug, and that wasn't just the appearance of the fruit. That was appearance of the whole plants, and where the consumer would be in there among the plants themselves, getting their hands into the plants, doing the picking. And they might object to having to deal with the masses of spittle if it's there. I hate the term spittle because of what the image that brings to mind, but that's exactly what the public is envisioning. Uh, so that's the public not wanting to get wet and sticky from the spittle themselves, and oftentimes there's not it's not that common a problem in a planting. So yeah, I don't know how commonly we would have picker clients or customers that will be turned away by this. I haven't seen such high infestations. Maybe other people have. There's never say never. The other type of cosmetic injury is the appearance of the fruit themselves, and that's often a problem with tree fruits because the cosmetic demands are so high in the plum fruits and stone fruits. Uh, it's not as often a problem, I think, with the small fruits, the appearance of individual berries. I guess individual berries might just be discarded when they're being picked if they don't look good. There's some issues with caneberries that blackberries and raspberries that are not necessarily insect related. The white drupelets, for example, or sunburn. So there are other issues that affect the cosmetic appeal of the berries. It's usually, the berries are so small. If the insects have been feeding on it, it's more likely to just ruin the whole berry rather than simply be a cosmetic issue on that berry.
Right, right. And I was definitely thinking about some things with peaches and apples where there might be something where it doesn't, some kind of blemish where it doesn't really affect the
Yeah.
fruit quality as far as we as consumers
No,
might
oh,
think.
no,
But
and you meant one insect that is largely cosmetic in the Mid-Atlantic area and north is plum curculio on tree fruit, on apples. It causes a fan-shaped scar on the side of the fruit. They don't survive, the larva doesn't survive well in the fruit, so you rarely find larvae in fruit, but it can be common cosmetic injury. Now, relating back to small fruit, plum curculio will get into blueberries as well, and it has caused some important infestations in New Jersey and North Carolina. But whenever I've shown pictures of the injury at a blueberry growers meeting here in Virginia, I never get hands in the air if they've seen it. I've never seen it in Virginia. Now we have a northern southern strain that meet in Virginia. Maybe there's something going on with the different strains of plum curculio there. But if anybody has run into plum curculio in blueberries, I would really appreciate finding out because an insect that's of interest to me.
yeah, definitely. And there's some things that, I'll still eat that apple or I'll still eat that raspberry or something that's got some aesthetic damage, but one of the differences in what we do on a smaller
Well,
scale
yeah,
versus what we
and that
did
brings up,
commercially is definitely that whether or not there's an intermediary as a buyer, right? And so
yeah,
there's those
and
buyers who will have really high standards that we
yeah,
can't do. We as home growers, my fruit doesn't look like that. It will never look like that because I'm unwilling to put that much effort into it. And yet when I go to the grocery store, I do want to pick out the best stuff. And
right,
that's gone through somebody
yeah.
already.
Well, another quality issue relates to spotted wing Drosophila. There's kind of a joke you hear a lot from people that always just a little added protein in the fruit, but that's not really the case. When the spotted wing Drosophila infests a berry, it begins an internal breakdown of the fruit, so it really breaks down and rots faster than it normally would. So that's really, I guess, it starts out as being cosmetic to a point, I guess, but it really turns into a quality issue rapidly. With by causing that internal breakdown of the fruit. The the the, the fruit gets inoculated with several microorganisms that speed down this breakdown, acetobacter and some other yeasts and things. And so that on grapes, it starts causing the production of vinegar in the vine berries while they're still on the vine, and it causes blueberries and caneberries to rot faster. So that's real. I think that really goes beyond simple cosmetic injury.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got a question in the chat from Mark. For the backyard garden, we can often withstand high levels of damage and not truly realize that that economic threshold is there. Though we might lose crops we have intentions to eat as a family or freeze and can. How do we make the best management decisions in the home garden if those economic thresholds are either not on the radar or what I was thinking of is just like taking action for them is just not something that we're able to do at that time.
Well, that's a good question. Home gardens are really different. You've already alluded to that too. People will often accept more injury in a home garden or in a farmer's market than they would in a supermarket. And so part of it depends on your individual levels of acceptance, given that many home gardens also the person is trying to minimize insecticide use, etc. So it kind of depends on how much you're willing to accept. I guess I would recommend being aware of the thresholds, what is normally being accepted commercially, and then decide what your tolerance is in your planting. And is it worth it to you to, get out a hand sprayer to spray the planting to prevent further injury of that sort?
Yeah, and I think something that goes in with that is probably like scouting and monitoring, which is something that we don't do a great job of, and well, I don't do a great job of in my home garden. Some of our, especially our master gardeners, do a fantastic job, but just you can't resolve something after you've, really exceeded that threshold or things have gotten really bad. And
Right.
so like
And if you're gonna, you should look at the plants regularly, ideally weekly or more. And especially when change is going to be happening, like the ripening process starting. It's easy if you're not seeing a pest, for the first part of the season to get complacent and stop looking at the fruit. But once the berries start to ripen, things can change quickly, and it may be too late to rectify it then, after that.
yeah, and I'm guilty of that, and especially I've got a bad problem with squash bugs, and I get into my squash bed every year, and I know that they're there, and I'll try to squish them with my hands and get rid of eggs, and then I don't take the time to spray, and I lose every single squash plant, and it's my fault because I know that it's there, and I checked and I saw it, and I just didn't take action. But that's as a home gardener, I don't actually need the squash. It's sad to not have the zucchini, but I can buy it from somewhere else. Versus those of you that the agents that might be working with smaller growers, having a wide variety of things on their farm and diversifying operations is economically important. And so they're trying to cover a lot of things at once. So
Right. And another thing to keep in mind, the fruit on these different crops, they ripen and are harvested differently. Blueberries is one general crop. Some will be a little bit earlier than others, but with caneberries, once ripening starts, it's constant. You have constant blooming, ripening, and harvesting, continually. So it gets very tricky to apply insecticides, and you have to be very cognizant of the pre-harvest intervals. And back when I was working on Japanese beetle on caneberries, the grower, actually, I've had this discussion more than once, but the grower was saying, well, we need something that we can spray, with a 1 day PHI, 1 day pre-harvest interval. And there aren't that many products with a 1 day PHI. It's much more common to find a 3 day PHI. And if you think about once you talk about it with a grower, they can usually live with 3 days, because by the time they get the fruit harvested, they have to deal with other issues, and they have to wait for other fruit to ripen and be ready to harvest. So 3 days is often sufficient.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we sometimes fail at in the home garden is reading those labels fully. And so if you are going to spray something, there's important information on that label,
That,
like
that
pre-harvest
that's
intervals and stuff like that.
That's very important. I haven't really talked about spotted lanternfly, but it's not that much of a small fruit pest. But I will mention it one regard here, because many the people online may end up dealing with spotted lanternfly in various ways as a vineyard pest or residential area pest. In some of the big box stores now, or the like Lowe's, Home Depot, etc., there's a product on the market on the shelves there called spotted lanternfly killer, and you have to read the label. It's not registered for food crops. It's for treating walls and buildings. And so, I'm really a little bit concerned that people are going to be buying that. It was deltamethrin, which is not registered on grapes, and be spraying that. And I just want to get that 2 cents in.
Yeah, I think it's definitely that's definitely hard. To especially one of the things that we can do as master gardeners and agents is be really informed about what's on the market, and when somebody calls us to troubleshoot things with us, that we're aware of all this stuff and we can help guide the consumer through these things.
Yeah, one other labeling issue that people should be aware of is for decades we've had carbaryl has been on the market, pretty good for home use. The human toxicity was not high. Sold under the trade name Seven. Now, if you go to some of these stores, you see Seven with different active ingredients, three different pyrethroids being sold under the name Seven, and that kind of bugs me. But be aware. If you're looking at recommendations and it says Seven, try and figure out what insecticide they're recommending. They're all highly toxic to natural enemies, but the pyrethroids are probably worse than carbaryl was. Also, but on the other extreme, carbaryl is used as an apple thinner. So if you were trying to thin apples, using Seven that was actually a pyrethroid, it's not gonna do the job.
Yeah, and then also if you're not trying to thin apples and you're spraying it at the wrong time, you will thin your apples if it is the right thing. So yeah, we are approaching our time. Does anybody else have any other questions for Ed right now? If not, we'll wrap up. Give anything for the good of the order. That's okay. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to contact me or contact Doug. This is going to go on online, and we'll follow up with some other things. This kind of economic threshold thing is definitely one of our more technical topics, but it's super, super helpful and really good and foundational for us, especially working on help desks and supporting clients in that way. So if you need other help or other resources, please reach out. We'd be happy to help. This is something I like to do too. So if you reach out to Doug and me, we'll make sure that you get the help that you need.
Okay, have a
Okay.
good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.